have to switch the slides or give us 1 minute. Let me start. I'm going to do some thinking while we get this fixed out. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. I've attended various elephants events, and I think you're doing a great job. And even though, as someone said, we're a little aging, we have quite a vision, though, because we are carrying the wisdom of a tradition that's disappearing. And so I think it's important that we don't lose heart. So when Tom asked me this, I thought, interesting. So I just let the Spirit play in me, and that's what I decided I would write about. But before I begin, I want you to think about 2 or 3 things that you would say. What do you think about the future of our faith? How can we make it flourish? So if you would just take a couple of minutes to do that, I'll turn around and see if we've got the slideshow. Okay, so then listen to me, and then we'll see if any of my things coincide with yours. And when we open it up for conversation, you can begin to share some of your own ideas. I know Chris quite well, and I know she'll probably be talking a lot about some of those statistics you saw up there. But I think for me, looking at those or hearing about them means that really that is a problem, but that's not the issue. There's a much larger context within which we are living, and the church is trying to bring its life into the society that we have to address. So when I started thinking about it, I decided the first thing was see how they love one another. Now I want to test that I don't have to look behind me all the time. So I said, see how they love one another. Now that seems sort of obvious, but I thought perhaps that's a key to the future. That the future of the church is to become safe spaces of love. Spaces, communities, in which all are welcome, and without shame or blame, can explore their faith or their lack thereof. Spaces where people can find community and understand that difference is not division. Spaces where our interior life is fostered so that we can become transformed into our most authentic selves. Spaces where we can embody our belief that we are all interconnected. Spaces where, like Jesus, we can offer another way of being in our world, especially those who wield power. A way of being that reflects the gift of the Spirit. Spaces where the rich tradition of over 2,000 years can be entangled with contemporary insights about who we are and where we came from. So I'd like to share then a sense of how we might do this in about 6 different ways. And I'm just going to turn periodically to make sure that I have it right. But first, a phrase we know. We need to read the signs of the times. That report that Tom just shared, Dan, right? Paul, like that, thank you. Just like Monica, I got to do the names right. Paul shared. It's very sobering. And I suspect we could put up almost any denomination up there, and we'd see a similar kind of diminishment. Although it is alarming on many levels, I believe it reflects an evolutionary moment that we are in. A lot of my work has been on the development of consciousness and evolution, and I believe we are living at another critical time in history where the chaos we are experiencing can be the source of a profound shift in evolution, through which something new will emerge. Such shifts, sadly, do not happen quickly, or even in one person's lifetime. They take decades, centuries, as worldviews shift and new understandings of who we are and how we got here emerge. I suggest that we are living through such a time when the various worldviews and values that have shaped human consciousness from our origins to the postmodern world we are living in are vying for dominance. As a church, we could say that our traditional pre-modern worldview is at odds with the postmodern one we are in, and we, the people, are caught in the middle. The Catholic Church, for the most part, has really never accepted the shifts that occurred through what was called the scientific revolution, or the age of entitlement back in the 1500s. Its monarchical structure of power couldn't accept democratic principles as that starts to evolve. And even recently, the insights of psychology seem not to factor into the Church's consideration on issues of morality, which have primarily focused on one's personal and sexual morality through the years. Although it is said that theology follows cosmology, we are sort of slow to articulate a theology that replaces a three-tier, unchanging universe within official teaching, as well as in our prayers and our rituals. Now, of course, with Vatican II, which I think, as I look around the room, all of us remember, it began to become more friendly with the insights coming from the secular world, and certainly Catholic social justice teaching stretched our sense of morality beyond the personal. Pope Francis has embodied these values in his theology and lives love. I thought of him quite a bit when I was reflecting on this. He's showing us how to create safe spaces of love. However, that's still an emerging sector in the Catholic Church. I believe we are in the midst of competing worldviews within our world and within our church. Many scholars who discuss the evolutionary nature of consciousness discuss the importance of including the values of all the prior stages into the emerging stage. Ken Wilber is one of these people. He's a philosopher, he's a well-known writer, and talks about this kind of development. And he says, really, we need to transcend and include. It's not that one gets better than the other. The next stage of consciousness widens our perspective, and we need to transcend the former one, but include all the healthy values of that stage. As we continue to evolve, humanity needs the best, the healthiest of all the prior stages. Because much of traditional Christianity never incorporated the values of modernity or post-modernity into their thinking and teaching, the healthiest values of Christianity were not integrated, and therefore didn't influence the next emerging worldviews. So I believe we are experiencing this gap with the exodus of people from the major faith traditions. People like myself, and most of us here, were raised in a traditional Catholic enclave and took seriously Vatican II, which in a sense catapulted us through the centuries into an understanding of subsidiarity, ecumenism. Remember, prior to Vatican II, you couldn't even, if you went into another church, you couldn't participate in anything, you just sat. Primacy of conscience, involvement in the world, and of course our option for the poor. And this continued to develop and deepen within an expansive view of civil rights in this country to include race, gender, sexual orientation, and participatory democracy. With knowledge of evolution and the development of consciousness, we struggle then with questions: who are we? Why are we here? And who is God? However, such questions were not being struggled with in most of our local churches or in the seminaries, I suspect. As Catholics became educated, we began to ask questions, to see the value of integrating some of what we were learning into our faith life. The sermons, the official statements left us wondering and wandering. Wandering to try to find a place of spiritual orientation to respond to those needs. Today we are witnessing a struggle between those worldviews. What is most ominous to me is the rise of Christian nationalism, and they're claiming to have the only truth, that this is what Christianity is about. Danger, there are parts of that worldview that fit quite nicely into our traditional sense of who we have been, and we must be careful, for there's nostalgia in that. However, I believe that Catholics, like those of us here, sorry about that, the screen there, are still connected to the church, have to find a small Christian community with whom they move and have their being, have a very important role to play in reading the signs of the times in the coming decades. So number 2, I believe we need to invite people to reflect on their experience of God, divine love, within the context of a postmodern world. We need to create those safe spaces for Catholics like ourselves and other people of faith to come together to support each other in a time of great upheaval. What we are witnessing now is going to take its toll for months and possibly years to come. To keep discerning the signs of the times and to see how our faith, when we reflect on such experiences, has something to offer to the larger planetary community. I believe we can give expression to new facets of how we articulate our faith that will contribute toward what is emerging and resonate with different generations, resonate with some of the younger people who no longer come through the doors. We need to explore how we understand who we are and why we are here in the light of the insights of quantum physics and evolutionary theory. To explore how to express our sacramental faith anew, affirming the priestly gifts of each of us, regardless of gender. And it's interesting, one of the reasons I wrote the book, Journey Faith in an Entangled World, was to try to offer ways of talking about the faith in new ways, in ways that reflect some of those insights. And maybe I was inspired by our parish structures in the US when we developed here a whole social educational system to make sure Catholics coming from the immigration community could have their faith. So I thought, well, can we envision something similar? Can we create those safe spaces who not only explore their faith together, but have a commitment to service and work with already established groups to keep working for, dare I say it, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusivity. Those are values for us. They're not just labels. We don't need law to tell us to not or do it, but we need to show by our life that we believe in it. And so to create those spaces with compassion and for the common good. And can we create community again and address the isolation and loneliness people feel? I've just been hearing on the radio over and over again the increasing loneliness that people have, even if they're living with people. And so can the faith motivate us to create those spaces? And I'm going to a third, and I may have forgotten to click it. Okay. So Tom, can you just... There's only maybe 1 or 2 words above the screen. But the third is to be a moral voice in the public arena and witness to who we are as planetary beings in the time of chaos and transition. I've been thinking a lot about public policy as I worked in Washington for 15 years, a very different time. But today, a public policy is not just political, it's partisan. You almost can't address a policy with a very practical resolution without it being slapped a label of either woke or terribly traditional. We can't vote for Republican or Democrat, MAGA or not. it's like the policies themselves now are tainted, and I'll use that word, with a very partisan flair. And so as soon as you position yourself, you too are labeled with that same thing. So I think we have to discover how to find ways to talk across the divide. Now I do have to say this, I do a lot with dialogue and having people try to talk with differences. However, I do believe the extreme ends on either side, I don't think we can. So I'm saying the vast majority of people who really are probably confused by all of us. I'm confused by what's happening. So how do we begin to talk with each other? And one way I was thinking is the more we talk about positions, we have to come to values which underlie our position. Because we should say, for instance, if we're talking to someone and we say we should be, with immigration even, we begin to talk about how that we are made in the image of God, all of us. That we become fully human only in relationship to others. That all creation is good, and that all of life is interconnected. Imagine if that was the policies that they were trying to propose, if those were the values underlying them. And then, they said that the universe's aim is the flourishing of a unified planetary community. I'd love to hear some of that language on the airwaves today. Or speak to the Beatitudes. Laws are going up to put the 10 Commandments in schools again. That's okay, but it's not enough. What does it say about what morality is again? Well, maybe we should get the Beatitudes up there, as equal. I'm not necessarily advocating that, but I'm just saying, we're going to be again, how do you argue against having the 10 Commandments? You see the positions we get in. But we have to know why we are advocating the other positions as well. The fruit of the Spirit, those 9, listen to this, and I love it. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And of course the common good that has dropped out of our discourse, political and ecclesial, I'm afraid, and the option for the poor. But we have that other part of our tradition, the Catholic social justice tradition. It began in 1891, and I suspect most of you are pretty familiar with it, with Rerum Novarum. But that was Leo XIII being rather revolutionary, because he saw the need for the church to begin to address the moral issues surrounding the new economic system that was being put in place, the rise of industrialization. It was brand new in terms of how people organized for the economic life. And he risked having a morality, beginning to talk about social morality, in which he then condemned the abuses, the inequities, and injustices of what was happening. And so he applied moral principles rooted in scripture and tradition to the new circumstances of today. Now, I believe Pope Francis, in Laudato, I'm sorry that's very small, so it's really, it highlights what I'm saying, so sorry about that. In Laudato Si, he too was like Leo, because he has a radically new look at what's the challenge today. And that was the intertwined social and environmental crisis that threatens our ability to flourish as a healthy planet. He uses scientific data. He suggests that environmental devastation brought about by our large-scale economic activity is threatening the health of the planet and its people. And he calls for dialogue and how to take care of our common home. Words that you're not hearing, but we're listening to what the purpose of some of our government agencies are supposed to be about. He calls for sustainable development and a more harmonious relationship between human beings and nature. Not just human beings, which is important, human beings and nature, calling it an integral ecology. And he says we're going to need transformation. I sad to say I've been listening to the word sometimes, and I hear transformation. It doesn't mean this in terms of political and economic structures. They're being transformed, but they're not being transformed within the context of a planetary community that's rooted in love, that the gospel teaches. In Fratelli Tutti, Francis even goes beyond sort of some of the scholastic theology of ordo amor. And I think some of you know that our vice president used that term to sort of justify why we should be against immigration, because it limits, we should do the order of love, is more rooted in my family, my neighborhood. Now this is scholastic theology, 1500s, and it made a lot of sense. Doesn't quite make so much sense today. So what does Francis tell us? He calls for fraternity between all peoples in a way that transcends all barriers and boundaries. He stresses the importance of a political culture marked by dialogue, charity, and he denounces a globalization that benefits only powerful economic and financial interests. He says we're hunkering behind barriers. We really are trying to see our individualism is taking over. And Francis says, no, a solidarity rebuking individualism and the lack of a true sense of global community united in a common purpose. We have to adapt something he calls a polyhedron, Polyhedron. All people, all cultures are respected and affirmed, and where the whole is greater than the parts. It's a far cry from what I'm here is happening today. And so the teaching church, I think, must teach Catholic social justice teaching. I think it would also be more appealing to many people. It's not political because it's not partisan. However, many Catholics don't know this. I'm afraid that probably many of our ordained priests don't know this. Not the ones in this room, but I suspect many of the guys didn't learn too much of this. And those of us who are still part of the faith will have to become active. The church, sadly to say, has lost most of its moral authority because of the abuse scandal. But speaking from one's heart and trying to live the values we're urging our public policies to embody can still be persuasive. So fourth, I think we have to make a commitment to one's interior life or the contemplative practice. Let me quote Karl Rahner. The Christian of the future will be a mystic, having had an experience of God, or he will be nothing at all. Sadly, the mystical tradition, which is alive and well in Western Christianity, was not taught to most of us. If it was usually portrayed as those who live in a cloistered community, away from the world, all day praying, and then we sort of thought, okay, it was a me-God experience. The mystical tradition is strong in every faith denomination. It's the encounter of the divine within us, dwelling within us. It's not privatized, but it has a real impact on the world. Today you hear words, mindfulness, meditation, contemplation. They're intermingled. However, within Western Christianity, there's a very specific type of contemplation that's part of the apophatic tradition. If any of you have studied any of that mystical journey in the mystics, the sad thing is this is something everyone has access to. And Evelyn Underhill said it's the birthright of every Christian to be a mystic, to be able to foster that intentionality of God within. It's a non-discursive type of prayer, and it's you're sort of emptying yourselves, like a kenosis, to allow divine love to work within you. Now, one awakens during that time to one's shadow self. And again, because our own tradition has a great sense of this in terms of sin, sin and shadow and all that can start to there's commonalities in some of that. But it's really our unhealthy self. And so in contemplation, you begin to find out what triggers you, what triggers that incredible response to someone who you really like and love, but oh my heavens, it's driving you crazy right now. What triggers you when I hear, perhaps, depending on your political persuasion, a certain person on the television, and you just get furious? What is it? What's going on? There's something deeper there for many of us. And so what contemplation does is an invitation to become aware of what's happening. So you don't just react, but you can respond out of your most authentic selves. And that, for me, is Christ consciousness. So today, many people, especially younger people, prefer to call themselves spiritual rather than religious. that's probably why when they turn 21, they're not coming back to church. They don't know, it's not quite speaking to them. There's a yearning to be in touch with the spiritual impulse within us. And developing one's interior life has not been primary in Catholic circles. And in the future, I think we have to give more emphasis to one's interior life and offer resources and guidance in those areas. The next is what the bishops and you all have been about, synodality. It's so important that Francis is calling, and I'm so glad he said we should continue to do that, because hopefully even as the next Pope, when and if the next Pope continues this direction. However, I don't think it will be true unless we focus on interior growth, because dialogue is much more than a skill set. It was interesting when I don't think we can do synodality except from a contemplative heart. When I started the Institute, I had a long time, did a lot of reading on dialogue, and there's a Bill Isaacs out of MIT, really put the insights of the philosopher, of the physicist David Bohm, into practical implementation around dialogue. And so I called him up, I was calling up a lot of people then, to see if what I was doing made any sense. And I just asked him, I said, do you really think, David, that, and Bill, that you could have dialogue without a contemplative heart? Now, I don't think Bill would use that language necessarily on his own, but when he listened to me, he said, I agree with you, you really can't. And the reason is because you have to be really open to the other person's position. You are not in the conversation to convert anyone, and that's on either side. If the bishops at the synod were hoping to convert the women from not being deacons, or if the women were hoping to convert the bishops not to allow them to be deacons, you're not yet entering dialogue. There's a real openness and an acceptance and thinking that I can live with the other's thought. And that's really tough. I mean, that is really, as we're moving toward a greater sense of interconnection and this polarity that we're experiencing, how do we do that? It's not easy. And so everyone has something to offer as we move forward. So when we don't even value engaging in dialogue. So today it's more about bullying and transactional deal making. We don't even have at the political level a desire to look for something that we could all move toward and forward. So to me, in a sense, that's sort of prophetic. And we need to learn how to listen. You intensify your awareness to what triggers and what makes you react. And then you see where you're blocking the other's insight. And usually it's the conviction that my way is the best way, the only way. And if you really, really listened, you would do it my way. And in every worldview that exists. And so we really don't have, until we can get to a place where we can stand more freely in ourselves and with others to really witness, I think, to what Jesus' message is all about. So you respond when you do that then from that magnetic center of divine love. And that's really important. And again, a whole section, the second gallery of the book, is all about contemplation. And in particular, there's an excellent piece that I have used for years by someone I worked with on dialogue. It gives you all the practical ways of doing it and how to do that. So the church is a microcosm of the world. If we can come together, hear our varied positions, and choose to really listen and move forward together, that would be revolutionary. And I think the gospel would come alive again. And so the final thing I would say is to educate for public contemplation. Now, that doesn't mean going out in the streets and praying together, necessarily. We may choose to do that, but it's not what it means. It's really a desire by Constance Fitzgerald, who is a Carmelite, a cloistered Carmelite out of Maryland, who has written extensively on the transforming power of contemplation. I talked with her way back in 2002 when I just was starting. Her readings inspired me. She really has been sort of my mentor. And she writes about, for the future of humanity, we need to do public contemplation. So it's really to see how we take a long, loving look at the real through contemplation. We are making new connections between the gospel vision and values in today's world. It really is immersed in the world. Public education is a profound re-education of human desire and consciousness, so needed in this time, in this Earth's evolutionary process. Because with contemplation, there are no longer walls separating the experience of God, of self, and of the world. Everything is entangled. One of the reasons the book says, entangled world. And she says, those who teach need to understand and believe in this transformative character, because the contemplative process is integral, not only to fully develop humanity, but to the new form of human existence struggling to be born. Today they say the next stage of evolution will be the human evolution of consciousness, with new neurological grooves, where we can see the whole before the parts, where we can see both and rather than either or. It's a new way of thinking. And we have some of the stuff of that in our tradition, and in what we can bring from our faith to today's world. And she says, this might be the most basic challenge for religion today, that education for a transformative contemplation, which would radically affect human motivation, consciousness, desire, and ultimately every other area of human life and endeavor. So I think how we respond to these insights is critical, because the issues that separate us are increasing as we become more conscious of how racial, sexual, gender bias, economic inequality, war, and the exploitations of the world's resources have influenced and shaped various structures within which we live, including the church. These abuses in our systems are becoming visible and no longer tolerated. And we won't, to just make them disappear does not address them. We have to deal with them in real ways. And the complexity is great. And so on the contemplative path, we can begin to imagine new responses to the polarities we are facing. We can grow in our capacity to hold a larger picture so we can move into the future together. And finally, Connie says, and what would we have to do to achieve this? If we believed it. What would educators in our schools and colleges do? Maybe we'd have an influx of students if we started teaching like this. What would business leaders meeting to discuss how to break the cycle of violence and bolster the economic vitality of our cities do? What agenda would politicians pursue? What would women's groups do? What would church leaders put their energies? What would each of us do if we believed in the enormous power of contemplative transformation in beloved Sophia? If we believe that and live it, I think we become those spaces of love, and possibly there will be new life within the church and the faith community. So, there are my thoughts for this afternoon.